Gentlemen, at our talk about should I automate finance and accounting at the Odoo Experience 2020. I'm Simon Stappen, one of the managing partners at Much Consulting, and next to doing Odoo projects, we also focus a lot of actually conceptualizing how much money you can save and how much you can improve if you digitize and automate. Okay, today what we're going to find out is who needs finance and accounting automation. And the three main goals of this talk are quantifying the actual cost savings of automating finance and accounting, showing the in-depth differences between the manual processes and the automated processes, and showing how you can adapt the results to other countries, as our results are tailored to the German market and to German jurisdiction. The study we did was in collaboration with the Technical University of Munich, and in the end, if we get into the topic now, you can differentiate two key things. The first is the real efficiency potential, so the money you can really track that you will save. And the second is all the non-quantifiable potentials that will save you money in the long run, but they're very difficult to quantify. So in the end, our question is, can your company save money by digitizing automation and automating finance and accounting? So what are the steps we look at in this process, so in a long-term perspective? In the end, one of the key goals of every company, and more importantly of every finance department, is to manage your cash flow. And I mean, in the crisis like today with Corona, you can really see that this is the key survival factor for a company. The way to be able to manage your cash flow in real time and really raise your capital efficiency and manage your liquidity better, we have the two steps before. The first is we need to digitize, because only if all our documents are digital, we can process them quickly and efficiently. Second of all, you need to automate, because if you have the digital documents ready and you automate how they're processed, you become way faster, and this will really help you to manage your cash flow in real time. So today, we're not going to look at all topics of finance and accounting. We're going to focus on two main processes that every company has. So whatever your industry is, whatever your company does, those two processes are relevant for you. The first is the purchase to pay process. Basically, you have a need in your company, you buy something, and at some point in finance, you get a vendor bill, you process the bill, and you often pay the invoice if it isn't paid yet. And the second process we're going to look at is the order to cash process. So that's when you sell to your customer, you have the whole sales process, you deliver your services, then you send an invoice out. You might need to send out some follow-ups or some reminders, and at some point, hopefully, you have a cash in. So let's go into the P2P process first. And the question at P2P process that we always ask ourselves is, can it be as easy as in real life? Because to be honest, no private person has any kind of P2P process. You go to the store, you pay right away, everything is hassle-free and super easy, and we kind of want to have the same experience for businesses. So if we get a quick overview over the P2P process, just to get you a broader idea how it works, you have the in-house demand, so somebody at your company needs something. Might it be a service or a product, doesn't matter. Then usually bigger companies especially do that more elaborately. You get different offers, and at some point you order something. In the next step, your service or your product is delivered to you, so you either receive the service or you receive a package and have the thing, and then you get an invoice which you later need to book and reconcile in accounting, and the last two steps are the steps we're going to look at today. So how does this work? We get our supplier invoice, as already said. In Germany right now, about 27% of them are electronic, so you get them by email most likely or per IDE interfaces. The second, more important part right now is paper. So you open your box, your mailbox every morning, you get 73% of your invoices out in paper. And in the electronic world right now, if you have a manual process, what often happens is you print the invoice out. Like you actually print it out to then process it as it would be a physical invoice. Processing the electronic invoices digitally doesn't even happen that often as you would think. And on the paper invoice, obviously, the invoice has to travel to your accounting team, which takes some time through your organization, and then will also be processed as a physical invoice. If we now have our invoice ready, We cross-check all relevant documents, obviously, because we want to know if we actually have to pay what was invoiced and if it's the right amount, the right product, the right price. We have to check a lot of formal requirements. In Germany, there are 7 core requirements, and then there are 3 more that are often required. And if everything is correct, we can approve the invoice and we can book it. Then we can actually approve the payment, so that's usually a management task. And then we can post the payment, reconcile it with the invoice, pay the bill, and then we have to archive it. That would be the end of the process on this line. But if the invoice is not correct, the question basically is, why is it not correct? And you have to discuss with your vendor, do you need a new invoice? Do you need a credit note for the old one? What has to happen here? There's a lot of things that can happen in the exception handling. All right, so how much does this process actually cost us? If we get a postal vendor bill, to process it through organization, on average takes about 1.4 minutes. As said, this data is a mix of first-hand data we got and data we collected from a lot of other studies. In Germany, that would roughly cost you 70 cents. Next step, you prepare the document. That takes about 2 minutes 60 and another €1.30 to do it. And then the really difficult step, if you have a paper-based process, is checking the invoice, because you need to also find the paper of your order, of the deliveries. That can be really hassleful, especially if your organization is a little bigger. So that part costs you €6.30, which is basically half the cost we have here. And in the last step, we approve the payment, and that will cost you €2.70. And in the 2 exceptions, so in the 2 other things we have to do in the exception, if on average the exceptions of all invoices cost you $1.70 per invoice, so that's the average over all invoices. Obviously, not all of them are incorrect, but the ones that are incorrect in average cost you $1.70. And then in Germany, we have very strong archiving requirements. So it's basically 10 years plus another 4 years, which means you have to keep the physical invoice around for 14 years, which obviously costs money, and it has to be organized in the ways you can find it again. This overall costs you 25 minutes of work, which is roughly €13.50. So let's look at how we can do it better if we automate the process. So again, we get our supplier invoice, and we might still get a paper invoice, but instead of doing everything through the paper line, we want to do everything through the digital line. So we take the paper invoice, we scan it, as you can see. This is really a main change here. The blue boxes is a main change in this process. We scan the invoice. Then in Germany, often the physical invoice is still archived, but that's obviously very expensive, as we learned. So we want to destroy the paper invoice, because that's the only way, in Germany at least, how you do not have to keep it around for 14 years. And next, our digital invoices meet our flow, because if they do not have structured data attached to them, so in Germany we have a format called Zugpferd, which is a very weird format that gives you structured data in invoice. But if that's not the case, we want to OCR scan it, and we want to make it ready for processing, so actually read all the data out of the invoice. As you know, there's a component in Odoo that can do this kind of activity. There's also a lot of other vendors that work a little better in Germany, because the Odoo algorithm is not really tailored for Germany. But now we have our invoice that's ready for processing. And basically this entire check part now that we had before is a lot of manual work. This is all automated. So the dotted lines mean that this is automated. And in the end, we only have to deal with this invoice again if it's wrong. So we have to actually manually find out what's happening. If the system can give us clues, but overall we would still have to find it out, and a person would have to deal with that probably. And then obviously the payment approval should still be by a real human. It's probably more effective, because you get a huge list of fully processed correct invoices that tell you if they're right. You don't really have to go into it, you just have to approve it, but it's a manual step. In the end, the money is sent over. This can be automated as well with ABIX interfaces in Germany, for example. But at some point, we're at the end of the process and our invoice is paid. Okay, let's now look how this digital, automated, and ERP-driven process, how much it costs. So basically the costs for the physical bills, we just leave out here, because what we found is that if you push your suppliers to give you digital invoices, you will get up a quota to up to 95-ish%, especially if you're in a more modern industry. So we now, for this calculation, assume that all invoices come in digitally, which makes our process significantly cheaper and faster. Second hand, the preparation of the document can sometimes still cost a little bit of money, because sometimes some data was not correctly recognized by the OCR, so we expect 94 cents for preparing the document. The check part still will be fully automated as we have all the other data in our system already and we can just cross-check and it works. And the approve and pay process still costs 50 cents because management time is quite expensive, right? And now we only need to handle the exceptions, which will be significantly easier because we have all the data already there. We don't have to find it in the folder. In the end, if we archive digitally, the cost is about 4 cents for the 14-year period. So that's quite reasonable, I would argue. And the overall cost now is €2.26. Okay, so next step, let's compare the manual and the digital process. What you can see here is by really losing mostly the check component and getting a little cheaper in all other regards, we can save up to about 12 euros in this process. So this is a really big improvement. You can look at the numbers in detail later. All right, let's go to our next process, the order to cash process. I mean, your cash in is quite as important as your cash out, so this is the next process we're going to look at. Just quick reminder, how does the order to cash process work? First of all, somebody buys something at your company. It can be through online shop, B2B direct sales. It can be, you know, in your store, for example. Somebody can order something there. There's a lot of different ways, but at some point you have a sales order here. And then obviously you fulfill the order independent of what you do. You deliver a service or product, doesn't matter. And depending on what you do, you have different documents. You might have your timesheets or you have a delivery slip that's outgoing, all this kind of stuff. And now, depending how you set up your business, you will send an invoice at some point that you can automatically book because, I mean, you know your product, so you know how to account for them. And in the end, you receive your cash and you have to reconcile. So let's go into the detailed view of this process. We have a confirmed order now. That's our starting point. We just assume all the services are delivered here already, or you just the customer just has to pay right away. So we don't really care about the delivery part, and we can automatically create our invoice because we already have it. We already know what we're selling. We create our invoice here. We check the invoice so we don't send out wrong invoices. Customers usually don't like that, as we found. And we can post the invoice and the receivables then. And in Germany now, we would print this invoice twice, which seems really weird. But one print goes into our archive for 14 years again, and the other one we send out by post to our client in the manual process here. So then we wait for the payment. If we do not receive our payment, we do follow-ups, and if our follow-up cycle is basically finished, we go over to the left-hand side, and then we can send the invoice to collection, for example, or we have like this court-based process in Germany how you can get your money. On that path, on the dark path that you don't really want because it's a hassle with your customers, at some point you get your money or your invoice paid, but this is so expensive that we're not going to look into that in more detail. But if the follow-up process worked or the person just paid on time, we have a paid invoice, we want to post the paid invoice against the receivable, so we want to reconcile them, and then basically our process is done again and our invoice is fully processed. All right, let's look at the cost of the invoice out process. So, as you can already see, there's significantly less steps, it's significantly easier, and it's significantly cheaper. If we do this as a quite manual process, overall we would assume it costs you about €5.50. In the follow-up here, we assume even though you send out the invoice by post, you do the follow-up by email, and obviously a lot of people pay right away, so that's why our follow-up cost is so low. If you do this all in paper, it will get significantly more expensive. So now the classic, so that's what actually most companies in Germany use, the classic order to cash process costs you about €5.55. All right, so let's automate this process. How does this look? Okay, we have a confirmed order, and then basically everything happens automatically, right? So all the data is in the system, it's digital, it's automated, the invoice goes out maybe at night, you have a cron job that runs and says, hey, this invoice has to go out, send it out. The receivables are obviously all created, the personnel accounts for your customers are automatically created, you archive it digitally, it's all interface-based, so there's nothing you got to do. The invoice is sent out by email or maybe by EDI interfaces, there's a lot of options here. and you wait for the payment still, but nobody has to wait physically because the system, knows when it's paid, so it would figure that out by itself. And if the payment is late, you can send the digital payment reminder out automatically by email, by text. There are a lot of options here. And this process on the dark side, when things go bad and people don't pay, would only get manual when you send it to collection or when you have a court-based process. And what we do with a lot of customers is actually we create a CSV file once a month where they can just send all their failed invoices to collection. So if the invoice is paid right away or after a follow-up, we can usually automatically reconcile the payment. There are a lot of different ways how you can do that. If the customer gives you bad data, you might still recognize his bank account, or you have a lot of different bank accounts you only use for one customer at a time. So there are a lot of different ways you can use here, and then our process is done. Okay, how much does this automated process cost us? Overall, printing and sending is out, archiving is basically out. You only have this, you might need to worry about your money and call the customer process after the follow-up, which is still quite expensive. So the overall price would be about €1.70. And if you now compare the automated and the manual process, what you can see is that you can save about €3.85 per transaction, which is quite significant, especially if your basket size is rather low, right? So next step. Could you save more money? And the way how you would save more money here is by receiving the payment upfront in a somewhat automated way. This obviously works best for transaction-heavy businesses with a very low basket size that can use online payments like PayPal, credit card, or SEPA debit in Europe. And this usually reduces your transaction costs. So the above processes was really B2B driven, big invoices, right? And this can now reduce your transaction cost in processing the invoice to about 5 cents per transaction plus the payment fees. So what we have to look at now, if we want to know if that's profitable, we have to look at how big the payment fees are. We just gave you very basic examples here. SEPA and credit card is from the provider Stripe, and PayPal you probably all know. So now, if I see the basket size growing, if I have a percentage, a variable price, PayPal gets kind of too expensive at around €100 basket size. And credit card, there are some lower fees for higher numbers. That's why we didn't want to flag it as red here. But at about €150, credit card payments might be more expensive than doing the original process like we had before. SEPA, though, is quite cheap here, but this does not account for SEPA chargebacks and SEPA bounces, which lead to a little higher cost than you can see here, but it's usually all fixed, so there's no variable portion. So what we can say is if your basket size is about €100 or lower, it will always be cheaper in Germany, even if you only do B2B, to use this process. Okay, so next steps, should your company go ahead today and automate finance and accounting? And to figure this out, what we did is we look at 3 scenarios. So we say, hey, we have a small company here, 1.5 million revenues. Cost of doing a small finance-driven ERP with some other components, about 10,000. Small company, it's a 2-week project, right? Scenario 2, you have a bigger company. It's still very simple in its business, but it does 10 million in revenues. Cost of the ERP, probably around 50,000. And the third scenario, you have a medium-sized company. It's bigger, it's 30 million, so it's starting to be quite big. It has 3 entities in different countries. You obviously want to do all countries and all entities at the same point in time, which is something we do a lot, for example. And then the ERP would roughly be around 100,000. And now what we do is we say, hey, how many ingoing and outgoing transactions do you have per month to calculate the amortization time? So that would be the time until you get the money back you invested. So to make this a little realistic, we say, hey, scenario 1 up to 100 in and outgoing invoices, scenario 2 up to 500 in and out, and scenario 3 up to 2,500 in and out. Okay, if you now look on the next slide, what you can see here is on the green ones, we have an amortization rate that's amortization time that's less than 12 months, which means in less than 12 months you get your money back, which is quite significant. That's usually a very good investment for your company. So what we say now is everything below 12 months is perfect. We want to do it right away. And what we can see is the more vendor bills you have, obviously the more money you can save because vendor bills are more expensive. And on our scenario 1, basically, the 50-50 in and outgoing transactions doesn't really cut it. But if you have 50 vendor bills and 100 outgoing invoices, you can directly save money here. In the scenario 2, 500 outgoing invoices are required if you only have 250 vendor bills, but if you have 500 vendor bills, it always makes sense for you. And it's a very similar picture we see at scenario 3, where with 1,000 incoming invoices, so vendor bills every month, you directly save money. And if you have less, you would have to have a lot of outgoing invoices, obviously. All right, so I think this gives you quite a good idea if you should do this. But what's more interesting is we can actually plug your numbers into our calculation and then directly calculate your return on investment. And that's actually a quite easy process for us, and we can actually adjust for where you stand today and where you want to go, so you don't have to do the from paper, 100% paper to 100% digital, automated right away, but there are steps in between, and we can basically do this calculation for every company in between. If you're curious, just write me an email, we can help you here. All right, so let's sum this up. Who should automate finance and accounting? And I think you already get the grasp. Really, everyone over 20 employees and more than 100 ingoing and outgoing invoices should really think about doing it. Your channel doesn't really matter. So if you're brick and mortar, if you do a direct to consumer business, if you do B2B, B2C, doesn't matter. It really makes sense for everyone. And actually, we've looked at a lot of different industries. And in the end, this kind of process is very similar for every company. So really, any industry should do this. If you're not a government agency, basically, there's no excuses here. All right. So if you have any questions, there's now a question session afterwards. And I thank you a lot for your time and for your patience. And I hope it was interesting. If you have any questions, just write me an email. I think the slides are also being made available by Odoo, but they will also be on our website. So just come by and check it out. Thanks a lot.
Hi Simon, and thank you for this very good presentation. So we'll do now the Q&A live session. We have one very interesting question in the live chat from Noor, who was asking about the cost of scanning. So she was asking about a need of a full-time employee for this if the volume is too high.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so usually the cost of scanning is quite small because on the size of company we are looking here, we're talking about, maybe 200, 300 invoices, and then let's say 75% come by mail. So you only scan like 200 documents a month. That's not a lot. Anybody that has ever scanned before knows, that takes about 20 minutes a month. But if you don't want to do it yourself, there are a lot of services in Germany. We have a company, it's called Kaya. They will basically scan it for you, and it's roughly 65 cents per invoice. And then this cost we could just add on our calculation, and it's still full service.
Okay, thank you for this answer.
Sure.
We have another question. Someone asking how many German companies are using Zugfert right now. So is there any statistics, if you know?
So Zugfert is only one of the standards. The idea is basically that we attach a structured version of our invoice after the PDF, so it's kind of part of the PDF file. There are a lot of different standards that are very similar, but Zugfert is the one officially supported from the German government. What we see at most customers that have systems that can read Zugfert is that about 10 to 20% of incoming invoices actually support this. So as you can see, the number is really small, so not a lot of people send those kind of invoices. And if you have a good OCR tool that can just read any invoice without having structured data attached, that's, in my opinion, a significantly better solution here.
Okay, thank you. So someone reacted to the question before. So do you think the limitations of Odoo to be used for automated finance?
I mean, it really depends on your market, because one of the things we add in Germany, for example, is a bank integration with which we can send money out, for example. That's a thing that in the Odoo standard is not available for German banks. So I can get my bank statements in automatically, but I cannot send money out automatically from Odoo. So that's one of the things where you have to extend Odoo. On the other hand, I don't know how good the OCR will be in Odoo 14, but in Odoo 13, we made the experience that we need a different OCR tool. So the image recognition for German invoices, they're quite special in many ways. Didn't work as well, so we used a third-party tool for this. But I think as the base framework in the middle, as the base system, where you can attach the right services, Odoo is very suitable for automated finance and accounting processes.
Okay, thank you. So we have the time for a last question. So you were speaking about Germany and the German market, but how does this work in other countries?
Yeah, so if you look at the process in other countries, it often gets a little easier. So since, as you might know, Germany is very tough on regulations, obviously the regulations for this kind of process are quite tough in Germany. So in most other markets, you can expect that the process is a little cheaper by default because the regulations are not as strict. And that you can implement it easier. For example, American invoices work really well with most OCR tools. So your digitizing cost will be a little lower, but your base cost will also be lower. So you might have a similar amount of savings, but obviously the labor costs are the key driver here. So you should really look at your local labor cost if it makes sense.
Perfect. Well, thank you very much for this last answer. We need to end now the live Q&A. Thank you, Simon, for your participation and for this very good presentation. And thank you all to all the people who attended. Bye.
Bye.